So we're going to keep on rolling with tank content, and yes, that pun is very much intended. My last video talking about the possible tank options available to Ukraine did very well. You guys liked it, you watched it, you put some very interesting comments down there. So I really do appreciate that. Keep an eye out for a video possibly looking at the T-84 yet again as maybe a next generation Ukrainian MBT or a base for one, and we'll kind of go from there. But I wanted to keep kind of on the topic of tanks for the moment. And, well, currently Norway is the only country that I'm well aware of that is doing tank trials. And doing tank trials between the Leopard 2A7 and the K2 Black Panther, two of the most advanced tank systems in the world right now. So this is a very interesting trial, and I wanted to cover it before we got any results. Now, I wanted to talk about this because, well, the trial itself is ongoing. So we don't have the results. We should know them probably by mid-2023. The estimates I had seen were kind of early to mid-2023, so, you know, with stuff like this, I always kind of assume it's going to be later more so than early. But I'll do a follow-up video once we get trial results from this trial. It's also important because Norway, while not being a massive tank force, does share a land border with Russia and is a founding member of NATO. So they're very important geopolitically speaking, and they have a very interesting geography that their armed forces are uniquely suited to that, like most U.S. forces, couldn't just plop into Norway and be fine. There's a lot of training that goes into having Arctic special forces. It's not special forces. Having Arctic forces, having forces that can operate in those kind of climates and those environments. So Norway's pretty unique in putting these two tanks up against each other in one of the more difficult terrains for a tank. So I wanted to talk about it. So what am I going to cover? Well, we're going to take a look at the existing hardware that they currently operate, their geography, land threats they may have to deal with, the Leopard 2A6 and A7, largely just the A7, but the image I found was the A6, so I put both there just in case anyone wanted to make a point out of it. The K2 Black Panther, politics and logistics, my personal thoughts, what I think the winning factors for either platform would be, my thanks, and upcoming videos. So if you want to know what I'm working on, stay tuned till the end of the video. So, what do they currently operate? Well, back in 2001, they acquired 52 Leopard 2A4 NLs from Netherlands, which is just the Netherlands variant of the Leopard 2A4. Now it is considered the Leopard 2A4NO for Norway. It's somewhat upgraded or just really updated or changed to meet Norwegian requirements, which is largely just internal stuff. Nothing major was changed. Some communications and radio equipment were changed out. Some weatherproofing stuff was also done, as the climate's not very forgiving. And they currently operate 36 of them. As we'll see with their geography, they don't have a lot of land to operate tanks on. So having a large tank force really doesn't do much for them. They need a fairly small but very effective force, and typically the Leopards are seen to be that. But the K2 very likely could be that as well. So, what are we looking at geography-wise? Well, it's incredibly mountainous, as you can see. This elevation map shows you that most of the country is pretty much just made up of the Scandinavian mountains, with some leveling off in higher altitude up towards the northern part of the country, and some coastal areas at sea level down by Oslo in the southern part of the country. Everything else there, you see some variation in that gradient, so not a lot of flat areas that you can operate tanks on, and for the most part, the tanks are operated in the northern portion of the country, which is also, conveniently, where the land border with Russia is. They also have a very large coastline. This is incredibly important as not only do they have to have patrol ships and things like that and Coast Guard vessels, as some of these sea lanes are fairly regularly trafficked, but they also have a large portion of offshore oil drilling. They're kind of one of the premier countries in the world for this as well, and that energy is not only important to Norway, but also a lot of Central Europe. So a lot of very important security and energy questions there. Meaning, tanks aren't as important, ships are much more important. And helicopters to an extent for stuff like that. But regardless, a lot of coast, a lot of important things out at sea, a lot more going on there than a large tank force. And their climate. Not only are you very northernly up in almost towards the, in some instances, in the Arctic Circle, but you're also very high elevations with these mountains, meaning this entire climate region, for the most part, save a few areas, is considered to be Arctic. So it's very cold, a lot of snow. Those are usually not circumstances in which tanks operate super well in, meaning the Norwegians have to make some changes here and there with their tanks, but it's going to be interesting to see how two of the most advanced tank platforms in the world operate in these conditions. So I'm very excited to see the results of this, because this is geographically a very interesting question to ask of these tanks. So what land threats exist out there for Norway? Well, not a lot, to be honest. They do have a border with Russia. It's about 123 miles long, so not a very big one. And as you can see, these areas are peppered with waterways, and there's only one main highway, the E105, stretching from Russia into Norway. So not a lot really in terms of maneuvering can happen here. But there is access points, and they do have a border they have to protect. They also usually, not really facing off, but are counterparted, if you will, on the other side of the border by the 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade, which was sent to Ukraine, particularly, I believe, in Kharkiv and the Donbass, and it has not done very well. It has taken very heavy casualties, so there's a lot less to worry about in this region in terms of large brigades of troops to kind of counteract whatever Norway has up there. Just kind of an interesting thought. If you want to know more about the 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade, Battle Order has a phenomenal video kind of following their track from their Arctic region down to Ukraine and kind of back again, if you will. So definitely check his channel out. Very, very good set of videos there. It's just awesome channel. A lot of my tank knowledge so far, especially from organizational standpoints, has come from that channel. So, what are the two competitors? Well, the Leopard 2A7 features the L55 120mm smoothbore gun. It is fully stabilized, has thermal optics, and stores 42 rounds. It has effective firing range of 4,000 to 8,000 meters, depending on what ammunition and kind of the situation. It has composite armor, which pretty much every modern tank has. Of course, they're different composites, so keep that in mind, but it doesn't usually stop most shells that are coming, unfortunately. Does feature blowout panels, though, so if the ammunition is hit, the crew inside is typically safe. It has the hull-on-fire fire system, much like the Abrams, and is compartmentalized, so once again, taking those extra steps to protect the crew. It is also, from what I've heard from tanker interviews and stuff, more spacious than that of the Abrams, which is weird considering it's lighter than the Abrams, but it is more comfortable from kind of what I've heard from Leopard tankers. Now, of course, you ask Abrams tankers, they'll probably say the opposite, but just kind of something I'd point out. It has a road speed of 43 miles an hour. I've seen some estimates that put it a little higher at 45, but generally speaking, especially in Norway, you're probably not reaching those speeds most of the time. It has a crew size of 4, which is pretty much all of this is going to be roughly the same from the Leopard 2A4s that they currently operate. So there's not a lot of changes that have to be made in terms of actual operation. And it has an operational range of about 140 to 200 miles, depending on certain factors. The 2A6 weighs 62.3 tons, long tons, 68.7 short tons. The 2A7V, which is I think the newest variant, which is I think the one being tested right now, is 66.5 tons or 73.3 short tons. Still lighter than the Abrams, but not by like a ton. But it can ford water or just move across rivers effectively with no preparation of up to 1 meter, and with prep time and additional equipment up to 4 meters. So pretty deep water. That's pretty impressive. It also has a digital battlefield management system. Once again, pretty much all modern iterations of all modern tanks have some kind of system like this, but it is kind of a selling point and something to consider. The K2 Black Panther, on the other hand, uses the CN08 120mm 55 caliber smoothbore gun. It has 16-round autoloader clips, or 16-round clip-fed autoloader. So that's kind of a weird way to phrase that, my bad. But it has an autoloader, and it uses sequential clips as opposed to the carousel system that most Russian tanks use. And it stores 40 rounds, so only 2 less than that of the Leopard, and it's quite a bit lighter by comparison. Not because of those 2 rounds, but we'll see that in a minute. 3 to 8,000 meter effective firing range, so pretty much the same thing. Composite with ERA and possibly some of the other things we've seen. Since it has an autoloader, blowout panels aren't necessarily as necessary, but I'm not sure if it's as compartmentalized because, well, it's one of the newest tanks that have been developed that we know about. So the insides of it are not necessarily the most readily available thing in the world. But it does have a crew size of 3. It has a commander, driver, and gunner. Since it has an autoloader, it doesn't need a loader. It has an operational range of roughly 280 miles. Once again, this can vary depending on terrain and a couple of other things. We have the weight being at 55 tons, 54 long tons, or 61 short tons, bringing it in about 10 tons lighter than that of the Leopard. Pretty impressive. 43-mile-an-hour road speed, once again, pretty much the same as the Leopard. An operational range of about 200 miles, 280 miles. Yes, I know I said that already. Forgot I put it in here. My bad. And it can ford water with no preparation of up to a depth of 1.2 meters, or with preparation of about 30 minutes and additional equipment of about 4.1 meters. So only slightly better than the Leopard, but matching the Leopard pound for pound here effectively. And it has thermal sights for the commander and the gunner. The big kicker with the K2 is it has a semi-active hydropneumatic suspension system. Basically meaning it has 4 different modes it can exist in. It has the sit, which lowers it down, means it achieves that speed on roadways better. It lowers its center of gravity. It brings it closer to the roadway surface, meaning it's just a little bit more fast, a little bit more agile in a way. It has the capability of what it calls standing, which means it raises up on its suspension, and it can traverse muddy or more difficult terrain a little bit easier that way. And being developed by the South Koreans, which have a very, not as extreme, but very mountainous terrain system as well, this is pretty important. This is something the Norwegians will probably see and think, okay, maybe this is something that we could use, and that's probably why it's standing off against the Leopard instead of the Leopard just being kind of the assumed winner. It can kneel. Basically, if you've seen any of the Swedish tanks that are a wedge that are kind of oriented downwards, that are designed to creep over a hill, fire, and go back down with showing almost none of the tank, that's the same concept. It raises its back up, brings the turret down, depresses it even more, so if it wants to go over a ridge and fire, it's not showing a lot of the tank, and for mountainous regions, that's pretty important. It can also lean, meaning it can raise suspension on one side or the other without raising the entirety of the tank in unison. So you have a lot of extra, it's not even really necessarily like maneuver on a large scale, but you have a lot more movement options with the tank. Does that mean it's maybe a little bit more complex to drive? Possibly. But from what the South Koreans have said, and this is kind of probably in the realm of sales propaganda, so take it with a grain of salt, the system itself is said to be easier to maintain than most regular tank suspension systems. Whether that is true, whether this is easier to maintain than like a torsion bar suspension system, I have no idea. But it is something to advertise, so maybe it is, maybe it's not. Who knows? Somebody, probably. The Norwegians will know probably pretty soon. And it also has a digital battlefield management system, so once again, kind of tit for tat on the same level the Leopard is, but that hydropneumatic suspension system, it's kind of giving it an edge in some areas. So in terms of politics and logistics, what are we looking at? Well, they already operate Leopard 2A4s, but they did not purchase them directly from Germany. They purchased them from the Netherlands. Now, with stuff like this, you kind of see it anytime a exported model is sold to a different country. The original country has to have some kind of sign off on it. You see this with the Germans, you see this with the US a lot. But they weren't purchased directly from Germany, they were just kind of given the go-ahead. That's not to say it can't be done now, but the Germans are kind of finicky about who they export things to. Even with supporting a lot of the countries in Europe in terms of tanks, they are kind of picky and kind of see themselves as looking for more premier customers than anything. Now, I will say when I made this slideshow, I meant to put, I got confused between the Netherlands and Denmark. My bad, people from Denmark and the Netherlands. Did not mean to confuse y'all. But this is actually still an important fact, so it kind of worked out for me. Denmark is currently getting Leopard 2A7Vs. Denmark is also pretty much just right across the way from Norway, meaning the supply chain is already kind of at their doorstep. Now, I know it's not that simple, but generally speaking, if they are having trouble in terms of manufacturing parts on their own or getting access to parts from Germany directly either via air or whatever, they do have a water route that they can contend with, and being a fairly large maritime force, they're probably pretty safe in terms of their coastal waters. So, not a big deal, but it does kind of give a direct line from Germany to them. It is also important to note, and why Germany might be considering them more of a premier customer directly now, they've imported a lot more gas from Norway recently, as, well, they can't rely on Russian gas. So they've increased their imports from Norway, as Norway is a fairly large energy producer in the region, and this has now become a matter of German security. So they want to make sure they can continue to rely on that Norwegian oil, that Norwegian energy, meaning they might be a little bit more reasonable in their terms if they do decide to offer something to Norway. And that's something that I want to talk about kind of more at length, because it's probably more of an important factor in terms of determining what the next tank for Norway is going to be, as opposed to the actual like hard stats of a tank. They're going to listen a lot to what their tankers have said, but they're also going to listen a lot to what the procurement officers say. The deals that get offered can really sway things, especially when you have a competition that's probably as tight as this one. So if Germany decides to offer them better terms, that might be the thing that pushes this over the edge. The South Koreans have been making a big push for exports, though. They made a pretty big deal in terms of moving into Poland. They had already done a cooperative deal with the Turks in developing their new Atlan tank, or Atle tank. And there are several other countries that are kind of considering this. So being in this trial is validating for the K2 to begin with, but having like if Norway does go this route, that's a pretty stunning defeat for German exports. But the tech transfer that was a huge deal for Poland is not as big of a deal for Norway because, well, Norway doesn't really develop their own tanks. They kind of just purchase them because they don't have necessarily the industrial base to do that. They don't have the workforce to do that necessarily. They've not had like a long history of tank development. Sure, they can do the maintenance and repairs and such, but they've not like indigenously developed their own tank. So sure, maybe it's kind of important, but it's not nearly as important as it was to the Poles. So my personal thoughts. The K2 making moves here is super important. Turkey technically didn't import the K2s, but they did go into a cooperative development process for their tank using the K2 as a base. So that's kind of the same thing. It's more of just like their own specialized version of it, with a lot more influence from the Turks. But the Poles are kind of doing the same thing. They're just sticking with the K2 moniker and making minor changes with the K2PL as opposed to staying kind of with the baseline K2, which is why their production's pretty important. But these two very high-profile exports kind of have the same concept going of, we will give you the capability to produce these. Now, whether or not that continues to be the thing is hard to say, just because there's a lot of countries out there that don't have that capability, right? The Germans have that capability, the Ukrainians have that capability, a couple of the other post-Soviet states have that capability, but generally speaking, you don't have a lot of that workforce and that industrial base everywhere else in the smaller parts of Europe. So this is important, but it's not to be overstated. Also want to talk about the German production capability, and I don't know why I left this blank, but effectively what I was saying is, with the difficulties in procuring energy, they aren't keeping up with production as much as they would like. Now, does that mean they're shutting their whole industry down? No. The German industrial sector is a huge part of their economy. They're not going to shut all of it down. But you have seen a lot of places just close temporarily because the energy costs were outweighing what they were making by producing whatever good or whatever raw material it was. So having that cut back may also play a major portion of a decision for Norway. If they like the Leopard 2A7 more but can't get their order until like 2030, 2035, they're not going to be super excited about that. Now, that's a pretty far out there and pretty far-fetched thing, but having production issues and having a lot of other customers in front of you can influence those decisions. I also want to kind of make a point here. The Norwegian economic mix, at least by GDP from 2016, so this could change a little bit. Agriculture made up a very small percentage, as you'd expect. Their industry made up just under 35%, which is not a terrible number here. This is pretty similar to what we've seen with kind of other countries that aren't super focused in terms of production. But their vast majority of their workforce is in services. And those two industries do not transfer to each other super easily. It's not to say they can't be done, but I just want to put this here to really push that the tech transfer of being able to develop K2s in your country is not a big deal for Norway. Even if their government likes that idea, their industrial base really isn't designed for it. That's not to say they can't do it, it's just, it's not going to be nearly as easy a transition and a flawless transition as it's something it would be for like the Poles, who have been doing this for a long time. So I just wanted to put that there. So winning factors, in my opinion, well, I would probably say the K2 has an edge, but in terms of its specifications, but I would say that that is not a deciding factor a lot of the time, unfortunately. The suspension system being kind of top of the list. That is a capability the Leopard does not have. And the Leopard doesn't really have anything else from a technical standpoint that the K2 doesn't. So you do have some problems there if you're looking just on paper side by side. Now, I've not really been able to find any tanker interviews of people who have operated K2s to know, is it spacious, is it comfortable, is it hard to work with the suspension system? It's still fairly new, so there's probably a lot of disincentivizing people from going for interviews for stuff like this. But suspension system is a pretty big deal. The weight as well. With terrain like this, even with it being frozen over, you don't want to go too heavy, which is why the Abrams is pretty much not in this competition. And you also have to consider, with a country that's like speckled with like fjords and waterways, is your tank able to cross your bridges? And if your tank's lighter and can cross more bridges, that's a little bit more of a important capability. It doesn't necessarily make or break a deal, but it's an important consideration. It also has a longer operational range, not by a whole lot, and with as mountainous as the country is, it's probably not a huge factor, but something on paper, it's important. And then you have the autoloader, which is a different thing for the Norwegians, as they are typically used to the whole four-man crew, but it doesn't really change the jobs of the three other people. It's just one gunner or one loader is really not going to be there. So kind of a benefit, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but just, some people in procurement might see that as kind of a downside if they're kind of stuck in their ways and, hey, this transition is going to take time, it's more training and all of that. A lot of the factors outside of what's on paper really make these decisions, which is where the Leopard 2A7 is. They have a lot of familiarity with the Leopard 2 platform. They've been operating Leopard 2A4s for a long time now. So the transition to the A7 is not going to be all that difficult, and they're probably not going to need a massive retraining of all their forces. Of course, people will go through training, but it's not going to be nearly as long as it will with the K2. They're going to have a shorter supply chain, getting stuff, parts, all of that from Germany or other surrounding countries that operate the Leopard if they can't produce them internally. And, Germany's going to be a lot closer than South Korea or Poland. So even if the Poles get up and running, it's hard to say if the K2 really can compete in that regard. And it stores 2 more rounds. But probably most importantly is that familiarity. Not only do the Norwegians already know this platform, their maintainers know how to work on it. Once again, the difference between the A4 and the A7 is not drastically different, so they don't really have to go through a massive retraining program. But it is the question of, does Germany offer good terms? And can they meet required deadlines in a timely manner? Kind of the same thing with the K2s, but the South Koreans haven't had any trouble in terms of, backlogs or hitting production dates and the things like that. So more of a transport question there instead of a production capability question. But regardless, on paper, the K2 probably edges out the Leopard, but in the real world, when you're talking with different people, procurement officers talking to people from the German government, from the Bundeswehr, from the actual manufacturer whose name I cannot remember, but it's not Rheinmetall, or probably somehow connected to Rheinmetall, but one of the German defense contractors, there's going to be a lot of other things brought up. So as much as everyone would like to think that all these decisions are made logically based on paper stuff, there's a lot of things we don't see that make these decisions, whether or not it's a larger familiarity thing like this, or whether it's like a comfort thing, or just things that being outside of the tank, being outside of the whole discussion, doesn't really allow you. So I think either one has the capability. I think when we see the results, it's going to be a very close trial. And I think either of these could really benefit the Norwegian military. So my thanks. Of course, Tank Encyclopedia is a great place. All of the little side profile images here have come from Tank Encyclopedia. That's pretty much where I get all of them. It's phenomenal. Wikis, Wikipedia, military wiki. I can't remember the exact name, but it's the military wiki. Then a couple of particular articles I wanted to cite here. The K2 versus the Leopard. Norway seeks a new tank in the snow from BulgarianMilitary.com. Kittel Kaputs. German industry stares into the abyss. Politico EU, which is the point I had made earlier about German production having issues. And the New York Times reporting that Germany's military-industrial complex is gearing up to restock its own forces, meaning that the Bundeswehr is going to take priority over everyone else. So whether or not that really means production's impacted that much is hard to say, but it is something that will play a part in making those decisions when the procurement officers and other officials are talking about it. So what am I working on? Well, the next few videos you're going to see are probably going to be Romania's next main battle tank, the Czech Republic's next main battle tank, possibly the Ukrainian case for the K2, eventually the case against the F-16 for Ukraine, and my more geopolitical focused, the upcoming Chinese crisis. You'll find out more when I talk about that, but there's a lot going on in China at this moment that is usually pretty indicative of some problematic things happening. So we'll take a look at that in the future, but next is definitely going to be Romania's next main battle tank, probably. Anyway, thanks for sticking around for this half hour, guys. I really appreciate it. Let me know if you like kind of the shorter form or if you like me to go on for an hour plus. And let me know what you think. Is it the K2's year or is it the time for the Leopard 2A7s? Anyway, I've been Cody. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.